I'm very pleased to be joined by one of the most recognizable voices on the air in New York City, WIN's radio newsman Stan Brooks, and the news director of 1010 WIN's, Ben Mevorach. Welcome to CityWide.
Thank you.
The most listened to radio station in the nation. Ben, what does that mean and why?
Well, for us at 1010 WIN's, it means 2.6 million New Yorkers, people in the tri-state area, but primarily in New York, listen to 1010 WIN's sometime throughout the week. Now, you take the individual station that's 1010 WIN's in this market, there's no other radio station in any market in this country that has as many listeners as 1010 WIN's. There are some programs that are on multiple radio stations that would have more listeners when you combine them, but 1010 WIN's, proud to say, for almost as long as it's been on the air, has had the most listeners of any other radio station in the country.
And why do people listen to the station?
I think mostly there are many reasons, Stan being one of the critical reasons, but I think it's because we reflect the city. I think that we are fast-paced in our format. We're a little bit in your face. We don't waste your time. We lean a little bit to the tabloid side in our story selection, and I think we move at the pace of New York. New Yorkers rely on us like they would a utility. You know, you turn the light switch on and you expect the light to be there. When you turn on 1010 WIN's, you have an expectation that you'll get your traffic every 10 minutes, you'll get your weather every 4 minutes, you'll get a complete roundup of the news, not only locally, but of the world within a short amount of time. And if you missed anything, you can come back within the hour and we'll have it for you again. And I think that format, that formula in this on-demand world is what works so well for WIN's.
Stan, I think that people take it for granted that there's always been all-news radio, but that's not the case. One day somebody walked into your office and said they had a new idea. What happened?
He mentioned something about all-news radio, and I think I looked and said, what's that? And I found out quickly that we were going to have a news hour, a clock, and we went out and hired lots of people, and on April 19th, 1965, we stopped the music and we started talking, and we haven't stopped since.
What was people's reaction?
What are you going to do when you run out of news, and what's all news radio? What do you mean? They couldn't comprehend the fact that you'd have a station that would do nothing but news 24 hours a day, no more records. When we first started, we lost all our commercials basically because we'd gone from a rock and roll station, and the people who wanted to advertise for that audience didn't want our audience. And so we did a lot of Smokey the Bear commercials. Every time one of the newscasters wanted a break, he'd play a Smokey the Bear commercial, which seemed to be the one that was done the most. And but
now, obviously, the company looked at this as a way to differentiate themselves from other markets. But was there also the sense that news would bring some prestige in the way that, you know, the CBS was always known its news division, the new movie about Edward R. Murrow, that news added prestige even to an entertainment company?
I would think so. The Westinghouse headquarters, Group W headquarters, was in New York. They bought the station in '62. And it was a rock station, and we had a big news operation in the company. We had a big Washington bureau, we had correspondents overseas, and we tried to showcase them. And what we did was we chased the teeny boppers away with all the news, and then 3 years into it, they decided, or 2.5 years into it, we're better off going all news and really showcasing our news operation and not trying to mix rock and roll and news.
Is this a format that's now been copied in other cities?
Not only in radio, but on television as well. It's the model for CNN. It's the model for other all-news stations throughout the country. And we weren't the first all-news station, but we were the first successful all-news station. And I think in part it's because it's New York City. And again, much credit to Stan, who was the first news director at 1010 WIN's, put it on the air, is the architect of the format.
Well, let me ask you about that, because it seems to me that not only is there more news happening in New York because it's a national center for the media and finance, but that the news that happens in New York is more important. So even if it's something as simple as a subway foul up, it could affect prices on Wall Street. Is that right?
Yeah, and even if it's not as important, we make it seem as important just because it is New York and it is bigger and and louder and all of those things. But certainly, if it's news here, it's much more likely to become news across the country. And if it's news somewhere else, until it becomes news in New York, it's often just doesn't rise to that level.
And we are the capital of the world, the entertainment capital, the sports capital, the crime capital, whatever. The Yankees are known around the world. There are Yankee fans all over the country. I don't think they feel that way about a Philadelphia team or a Boston team. Our theater, everything that happens in New York, people want to know about. And I guess it's such a big city, everybody's got a relative there, so they want to know what's going on if there's a blackout, if there's a big disaster. But a testimony to the fact that we're the most listened to station. When I walk down the street on a story carrying my mic, I can't tell you how many times somebody says, "Hey, 10-10 wins, you give me 22 minutes, I'll give you the world. Which one are you?" It goes on all the time.
Now, is it frustrating to you that people know your voice but not your face?
No. But people say, "Oh, which one are you?" And I say, "Stan Brooks." They say, "Oh, I've listened to you for 30 years.
Right.
And for the record, I say I'm Stan Brooks as well, because it bores well. It helps me.
So how do you decide what gets on the air? You only have 22 minutes.
Oftentimes the struggle isn't so much what you're putting on the air, it's the decision on what you're keeping off the air, because there is so much information coming into our radio station over a 24-hour period. I mean, there's just the amount of information that we have to sift through on any given day. When I step into my office, I have to go through 300 emails every morning at the start of the day, and then there's probably another 200 or 300 throughout the day. So we look at a lot of different things. We're in the business of selling sound. That's what radio is. So we have to marry stories, just like television marries stories to pictures, we have to marry them to sound. So a story will have more or less prominence on the show depending on what kind of sound we have that goes with the story. The amount of impact it's going to have, how many people are affected by this particular story, that's a major part of the decision making. How much detailed information is there? There are some stories that are very important that we can't do because our average story length is about 40 seconds. And we have to say, look, for the news consumer, if they need to know that story, they're going to have to go to another source because we just can't do it in 40 seconds.
I was going to say there are two decisions. What stories do we want to put on the air? And then when we do that story, how much of that story can we get on the air? And then you have to crystallize and pick out the most salient facts, give a little bit of color, a little bit of humor or pathos, whatever it is, and make it a package of 40 seconds.
So, Stan, you've been covering city budgets for the entire time because a lot of the work you do is from City Hall, although not exclusively about City Hall. So every year the City Council does a budget, and every year they fight with the mayor. Is it basically the same story every time?
It's basically the same story of a fight, a tug of war. But then you're looking for the one issue in the budget that might be of interest to the people, whether it's a property tax, whether it's a tax cut, whatever. But you're looking for something that people can identify with, whether the libraries that have been closed on Saturdays and Sundays are now going to be open, whether there's going to be more money for the museums, whatever. But you find something that's a little bit different, and that will capture the person's interest.
Is there a story that's better told on the radio than in a newspaper or on television?
Oh, all the human interest stories that involve people, where people are happy or sad. The emotional stories are best told on radio, where you have somebody jumping for joy and screeching with joy. You have somebody crying. You have somebody being sad. The emotional stories I feel like a blotter sometimes. I should be a blotter to capture all that, soak it up, and then give it back to the listener. With emotion, with humor, with sensitivity.
One of the best arguments I can give you about why radio, I think, is so powerful in 40 seconds and more powerful than television in a lot of ways. When we do a description of, let's say, a lost child or a child who was hurt or any story you can think of that has the emotional attachment, when people start to paint that picture in their mind, they personalize it. So if we're talking about a little girl who's missing, in the listener's mind, they're painting the picture. If we say she has blonde hair, blue eyes, whatever the description, it may look like, by the time we're done with the story, to the listener, like their niece, like their granddaughter, like their daughter. It becomes very personal for them. Where in television, as effective as it is, the picture's up on the screen, and you've taken all of the work out of the personalization of the story. And so I think that's where radio really is magical.
Well, that's almost turning Marshall McLuhan on his head. He said that radio was the hot medium and television was the cool medium, and radio was in your face and television would draw you in. You say it's the opposite.
I think a well-written radio story will trump any other medium. Absolutely.
I enjoy reading a book more than I enjoy seeing the movie, because I've pictured it in my own mind. I've made the characters come to life, and I may not like what the producer did.
Is the mix of story important also? You're almost like a jazz musician trying to decide which riff is going to follow which. Yeah,
absolutely. And for in a city like New York, although thankfully less so with the crime rate being so low, You don't want to give the audience in their listening experience, which for WINS is about 45 minutes. You don't want 45 minutes of crime stories. You don't want 45 minutes of medical stories. You don't want 45 minutes of funny stories. You have to find the right mix so that when people, it's almost like a meal. We sort of look at it that way. You come in for your meal, you want to have your meat and potatoes. You want your lead story, you want to know that the city is safe or what happened. But when you push away from the table, when you're just about done with your listening experience, a little dessert. You want to feel good when you get away from the table.
Now, you just said something very interesting. The typical person listens through 2 cycles. They listen through 45 minutes. Is that because they want to sort of reassure themselves that they've caught everything, and after 45 minutes, if they've heard the same story twice, now they know nothing else?
They feel as though they're up to date.
And they feel safer?
Absolutely. It's sort of like a carousel. People get on and off at all different times, but for the duration of the ride, what they're on there, we give them everything that we've got in those 2 cycles, and then they can go away saying, you know what? Okay, the city's okay. I feel as though I know everything, and I'll come back later and get back on the carousel in the afternoon. And again, I'll listen until I know everything is okay. When I hear a story again, I know that I've gotten what I need.
I know a lot of people who say they listen in the morning, then if they get to their office, they have a radio, maybe 11 or 12 o'clock, they'll turn it on again late in the afternoon and then at night.
We're going to keep talking about talk radio when Citywide continues right after this.
I like to volunteer for the neighborhood emergency response team to help the firefighters. As you know, I was Fireman of the Year 3 times.
You're Mariano Rivera.
Thank you.
Fireman of the Year is a baseball award.
Yes.
You're not actually a fireman.
No.
Fireman of the Year, huh?
Just a few more minutes.
When you help your neighbors, you help your nation. Everyone can do something.
Visit us at usafreedomcorps.gov.
Welcome back to Citywide. We're speaking with WINS radio newsman Stan Brooks and the news director of 1010 WINS, Ben Mevorach. You are part of the same corporate family as your competition, CBS Radio 88. Are you really competitors, and do you think that the fact that you're now owned by the same corporate parent means that there's less diversity in the voices on the air?
I would know less diversity because we really do serve largely different audiences. We are primarily a city, 5-borough-centric radio station, and we give a lot of coverage to the suburbs. And CBS is primarily suburban in its focus with some city coverage. So I don't think there's any diversity question. As to the competition, you can never take the competition out of the reporter. So, Stan can answer that better. But, when you're pursuing a story, you don't care if it's your brother. You want that story.
Yeah, you want to beat the other guy. You want to get the best story. You want to get it faster. You want to write it better. You want to tell it better, better sound. And I sit back to back with my competitor, but I want to do a better job than he's doing.
Can you break stories on the radio?
If you get to your cell phone and go outside the building, you don't do it with 4 other people sitting around.
And what about all the voices, particularly at City Hall? You have so many groups that mainstream politicians would categorize as fringe, people who have issues that don't necessarily touch the broadest audience. But how do they get their voices heard?
They've got to be creative, come up with a good idea, a gimmick of some kind, get on the steps of City Hall, get a big crowd out there, make a lot of noise, which adds to the flavor of the story. You get 100 people on the steps of City Hall chanting, waving signs, and with some basic message to tell, you'll get on.
The late Doug Edelson, who was also a broadcast journalist, claimed that it was the City Hall reporters that invented the idea of a City Hall press conference because it was just more convenient for them to be able to go out of their offices rather than having to schlep up to Midtown. Is that true?
I don't know. I'd like to reinvent it because this mayor likes to take us all over the city. And when you're going around a city as big as New York City, if you go to Staten Island or far out in Brooklyn, it takes an hour to get there. The mayor usually comes about 10 or 15 or 20 minutes late, and an hour to get back. And you kill 3 hours to get one piece of news, whereas if you did it in the Blue Room, you could go down there for 10 minutes and then shoot back to your desk and file the story. So it takes time. The news conference in City Hall is a much better vehicle for us.
Let me ask you a little bit about traveling around the city. Perception that I have that there was a period of time when the radio stations were more likely to cover an outer borough story, other than Manhattan story, because you could get on the subway, or if you had a car, your equipment was your tape recorder and I guess a bunch of quarters to call in, as opposed to one of the television stations that had to take all of this equipment around. But that when New York One came on the air, cable news, all news, that they had these young reporters with very lightweight equipment that they were sending to places that the other stations weren't, and that the television stations were sort of forced to react to that by buying all of these vans, and that they are now more likely to go out because they've got all this mobile equipment that they have to justify. Am I right that sort of the mix of stories has changed? And also, what other impact do you think all news television has had on how the rest of the media covers the news?
Well, we've gotten rid of cycles. That's the first thing. There are no news cycles, and no AM and PM. It's just continuous news pouring out, and the stories change as they go along. I think one of the things that we do, and I've always felt this from day one, 40 years ago, that we give the public a chance to see how a story builds. Radio and television in the past would give you a finished product on the 6 o'clock news or the 11 o'clock news. We get to the scene, we give a basic report, something happened here, there was a shooting, we don't know if anybody's dead, but we're working on it, the police have just arrived, and then we develop that in a fishbowl, for example, for people to see and hear how a story develops. And I think we've educated them, and I think we've also whetted their appetite, because they can see the story build, and it's like watching a serial. But I think we're all out there doing the same thing, and with no AMs and PMs. It's just continuous.
I mean, the only thing I'll really add to that is that there is some truth in what you're saying. I mean, we'll go if the story is big enough. We'll go. It doesn't matter where it is. We'll go, as will all the other city stations. But what's happened we've been fortunate at WINS, but in news in general, there's been such a cutback in the number of folks out in the field that when you're making news decisions, sometimes it's not based all the time on the importance of the story. It's based on, well, I've only got 3 reporters today, and if I send this one to Staten Island, I won't be able to send him to the Bronx if something happens in the Bronx. So if I stay in Manhattan, I only cover the Manhattan stuff, I'll be okay, because and it becomes a very difficult thing. Even the TV crews and us on the weekends, because we run with fewer reporters, if there's a major story on Long Island, we will try to get it by phone, because to take a reporter or 2 reporters out of the city, send them out to the eastern part of Long Island, means that reporter is gone for the day. And if something else happens, you don't want them that far away from the station. So there are other things at play in the decision making on stories. It's not just, boy, this story's worth covering.
And how about the extent to which your news judgment get influenced by what other media are doing? If I assume you monitor
Sure.
the TV and other radio stations. If you think that there's a big story, if you see that people are gravitating towards a story, does that force your hand?
Well, yes. I mean, I think it affects all of us. If there's a great story on the front page of one of the newspapers, we're all going to chase it. But it also has the other effect in that everybody wants it first, so that if we're all on a story, or we all get wind of a story, we're all running after it at the same time. What I always find interesting, particularly, it's more of a TV thing than a radio thing, is there'll be something in the paper or something on the radio, and the TVs won't cover it because it's in, it's in the competition, we won't touch it. Then about 2 weeks later, you'll see it as a story, as if it's brand new, popping up on the television station for the first time. And, most people don't know that. They may not have read the paper that day, so they don't know 2 weeks later that suddenly on one of the TV stations they were running it as if it's their own. But that's part of the competition.
I was going to say, I think we go further afield than we used to when I was the news director. We go up to Hartford, Connecticut. If there's 5 people killed in a bank, we'll shoot up there. If there's a disaster of some kind, we'll go out there, or a major story. The governor of New Jersey is about to resign. We didn't go out as far in the old days. I think we go out.
I also want to ask you about sort of bringing a New York sensibility to covering a New York story out of the city. When the mayor goes to Israel, and mayors always go to Israel. You may go on a trip like that, or if somebody's a candidate, you may travel with them, or cover New Yorkers who were in combat in the Persian Gulf or something like that. You could just as easily have somebody locally based report on the events there. Is it important that people who are from New York cover the figures of New York even when they're not in New York?
Well, Ben went to the Mideast for the Gulf War.
I think it's much more important for the TV stations have this feeling that they have to have their own people on the story. We'll make the decision, again, based on specific needs. We rely heavily on our network affiliates. But the advantage of when I went over to the Middle East, or we went to New Orleans, we went.
Juliet Papa went to Rome.
Right, went to the death of the Pope, is that you can find the local stories in those national events. So if you're using your national correspondents or your network affiliates, they're just getting sound and talking to anybody down there. We're looking for the couple from Queens that happens to be down, who made the pilgrimage down to Rome for vigil for the Pope. And that's what makes it a New York story.
And I think having your own person on the scene, whether it's in Rome or the Middle East, I think the audience identifies with that voice and says, oh, that's Juliet Papa. She, I know her. I know this one. I know that one, rather than a voice of a network correspondent.
I've had it suggested to me by a real cynic in the business that there was this multiplier effect of how many people had to be affected in order for it to be news in New York. That, one New Yorker equaled 100 people in Europe, equaled 1,000 people in Africa and down the line, and that the further away it was, or the less the New York content of it, the less likely it was to get on the news, and the bigger the disaster. So, a New Yorker stuck in the hurricane in New Orleans was a better story than the terrible tragedy in Pakistan with all of the people being killed in the earthquake if there were no New Yorkers involved. Is that true?
I suppose in a philosophical discussion it might have some merit, but the truth of the matter is there are so many Pakistanis living in New York that something that happens in Pakistan is a local story. Oh. And so we don't look at, we look outside of our geographic area, we don't say, oh, outside of our geographic area, because there's so much happening out there that is still of such local impact to New Yorkers.
That's a great point. Is it more difficult, Stan, because of all of the ethnic diversity in the city? Now, so many foreign-born residents, difficult names to pronounce, people who don't speak English as their first language. What does that do?
Most of the time, it's not a problem. Most of the communities, there's somebody who speaks English. And if they speak it with an accent, that makes it even more real. But we've been going out more and more to the Arab community, the Greek community, the Pakistani community, to talk to people when there's something happening overseas. But I was going to say that I think 9/11 has changed a lot of that. We've had a major disaster here, a horrible disaster. I think now when there's a tsunami in the eastern part of the world, when there's an earthquake, I think we realize now what that means. We never had that before. Now we can empathize with the people who are losing loved ones and not knowing who's alive, who's dead, and seeing buildings crumbling down. We never had that before. An earthquake did not really mean that much to us. Now I think it resonates.
And what will all news radio be like 10 years from now, 20
That's
years
a
from now?
great question. One of the things about WINS is that it's on demand. If you want your sports, it's there at 15 and 45. You get your traffic on the ones. The world now has actually become more on demand than WINS. Now when you wake up, you don't need necessarily to listen to sports at 15 and 45. You go on the internet, and it's right there, and you get your sports scores. So we are now in the content providing business. Radio is one way we provide content, but now we're also streaming on the internet. We're providing podcasts. We have a website. So I think the future of radio is that we will continue to move in this broad content providing format in which radio, the on-air signal, will be our main thrust, but we'll be providing content in so many other ways for the audience, because I think that's where they're going. They're going to different places.
My wife gives me a hard time. She said, I wonder what to wear today. I don't know what the temperature is. I said, let me turn up the radio. And I listened. She said, I can go on the internet and get it right away. We don't have to wait.
Well, my thanks to WINS radio newsman Stan Brooks and 1010 WINS news director Ben Mevorach for giving us the world of all news radio. And thank you for joining us.